The Netherlands has more bicycles than people, roughly 23 million bikes for a population of 18 million. And that's not just a fun statistic. It reflects how deeply cycling is woven into everyday life here. In Amsterdam, nearly 40% of all trips are made by bike. In cities like Utrecht and Groningen, it's even higher. There are dedicated bike highways, multi-level parking garages just for bikes, and intersections where cyclists get their own traffic light phase. And not that long ago, Dutch cities looked a lot like everyone else's, packed with cars, choked by traffic, and increasingly dangerous. So what changed? How did Dutch cities go from prioritizing cars to completely rebuilding themselves around bikes? To answer that, we need to rewind the clock to a time when the bicycle ruled the roads, and then almost disappeared. Long before cars became the default, the Dutch were already cycling everywhere. By the early 1900s, bicycles were a common sight on the cobbled streets of Amsterdam, The Hague, and smaller towns in between. In fact, by 1911, the Netherlands had more bicycles per capita than any other country in Europe. They were not seen as a luxury or a sport, they were simply how people got around. Men rode them to work, women used them for errands, children cycled to school. It was normal, unremarkable, and incredibly widespread. By the eve of World War II, there were around 4 million bicycles in the country, almost one for every 2 citizens. But the war changed that. During the German occupation, many bikes were confiscated by the Nazis, tires were rationed, and replacement parts became impossible to find. By the end of the war, nearly half of all Dutch bikes were gone. But the culture hadn't died. As soon as peace returned, so did the bicycles. By the 1950s, cycling was once again the default. The average Dutch person pedaled around 1,500 kilometers a year. That's more than what many people drive annually in some cities today. It was this deep familiarity with the bicycle that would quietly lay the groundwork for the country's transformation years later. But then, the car arrived. After World War II, the Dutch, like much of the Western world, started chasing a new dream, the car. In 1950, there were only about 139,000 cars in the Netherlands. By 1970, that number had exploded to 3.4 million. That's a 24-fold increase in just 2 decades. People were earning more, roads were being expanded, and car ownership became a symbol of progress. The government fully bought into the vision. Inspired by American planning ideals, Dutch cities started redesigning themselves around cars. Roads were widened, highways cut through neighborhoods, and in Amsterdam, some planners even proposed paving over canals to make way for traffic. Yes, paving over canals. Cycling, once dominant, was now seen as outdated. In some places, it was treated like a temporary phase, something kids did until they could drive. In just a few years, entire neighborhoods were rebuilt to move cars faster. Cyclists were pushed to the edges, both literally and politically, and the numbers showed it. In Amsterdam alone, the percentage of trips made by bike dropped from around 80% in the 1950s to just 20% by the early 1970s. That kind of collapse wasn't just the result of more cars, it was the result of policies that actively deprioritized cycling. And with more cars came more danger. Streets that had once been safe for children suddenly became hazardous. Fatal crashes started to rise, and people started to notice. That would lead to a tipping point, one that began not in Parliament or City Hall, but in the grief of a father who lost his child. By the early 1970s, the cost of car dominance in the Netherlands had become impossible to ignore. Streets were no longer just crowded, they were dangerous. In 1971 alone, more than 3,000 people were killed in traffic. Over 400 of them were children. Parents were grieving, communities were angry, and the government couldn't hide behind numbers anymore because those numbers had faces. One of them was a 6-year-old girl named Simone Langenhoff. After she was killed by a driver, her father, a journalist, published a devastating article titled "Stop de Kindermoord," which means stop the child murder. That phrase hit like a thunderclap. It became a rallying cry. Protests broke out across the country. Streets were occupied not by cars, but by parents, teachers, and kids demanding safer roads. People staged die-ins, laid down bicycles in memory of the dead, and turned public grief into political pressure. These were not fringe activists. These were ordinary families who had reached their limit. Even the police, in some cases, let the protests happen without interference. The movement struck a nerve that crossed political lines. It wasn't about banning cars, it was about balance, about safety, about letting children ride to school without the fear of being hit by someone late for work. And for the first time in decades, the government started to listen. But public anger alone wouldn't have been enough. What came next forced the conversation into a full-blown national crisis. In October 1973, the price of oil quadrupled almost overnight. OPEC had imposed an embargo, and the Netherlands, having sided with Israel, was one of the countries hit hardest. Suddenly, the fuel that powered this new car-centric world became scarce and expensive. The Dutch government reacted quickly. One of the most radical ideas, banning cars from the roads on Sundays. And so, for a few weekends in late 1973, the highways fell silent. No engines, no traffic, just families walking, kids playing in the streets, and cyclists, thousands of them, reclaiming the roads. For many, it was the first time they'd experienced their city without the constant hum of cars, and it left a mark. People began to ask questions. Do we really need to build everything around fuel, around cars, around traffic? It wasn't just a fuel shortage anymore. It was a moment of clarity, a sudden pause that forced the country to rethink its direction. And the timing couldn't have been more critical. Public pressure from Stop de Kindermoord was already mounting. Now the oil crisis added a new layer of urgency. Dutch leaders realized they couldn't just keep expanding roads forever. The model was breaking, and they needed alternatives, not someday, but now. That opened the door for policies that, just a few years earlier, would have been politically impossible. And it started with listening to the people who were already reimagining what a city could be. Activists from Stop de Kindermoord weren't just marching, they were showing up with ideas. They held meetings with local officials. They proposed redesigned streets, and in a surprising twist, the Dutch government actually funded them. That's how serious it had become. With government support, the group opened an office and started shaping real policy. One of their first contributions was the concept of the Woonerf, a residential street where cars were still allowed, but strictly on the terms of the people who lived there. Narrow roads, low speed limits, shared space. Pedestrians and children came first. At the same time, cyclists formed their own advocacy group. In 1975, the Fietsersbond, the Dutch Cyclists Union, was born. They held mass bike rides on unsafe roads, painted DIY bike lanes overnight, and made sure cycling stayed on the political agenda. Some cities took things even further. In Groningen, the city council launched one of the boldest traffic experiments in Dutch history. In 1977, they divided the city center into 4 sections. Cars could drive into each section, but not through them. If you wanted to go from one side of town to the other by car, you had to exit, circle around the city, and come back in. Cyclists? They could go straight through. The goal was not to punish drivers, it was to reward people who made sustainable choices. And it worked. Cycling in Groningen exploded. Businesses didn't collapse. The city didn't grind to a halt. Quite the opposite. It became quieter, safer, and easier to get around if you were on a bike. Not everyone loved it at first. Shopkeepers feared they'd lose customers. Some residents were furious, but the results spoke for themselves, and other cities began paying attention. The shift was happening. What started with grief and protest was now becoming law and infrastructure. With growing public support and political will, Dutch cities began putting real money into cycling infrastructure, but they didn't get it right on the first try. In the late 70s and early 80s, cities like The Hague and Tilburg started experimenting with dedicated bike lanes, bright red asphalt routes that cut through urban areas. They looked good, they attracted cyclists, but they were scattered and disconnected. People would ride a safe stretch, only to be dumped into traffic a few blocks later. That's when planners realized isolated bike lanes don't change habits, networks do. So the city of Delft tried something different. Instead of building a few showcase paths, they invested in a full network, safe, connected, and citywide. The result? Car use dropped, cycling increased. It was one of the first measurable signs that good design could shift behavior. Other cities followed, and by the mid-1980s, the Dutch government made cycling a national priority. Over the next decade, they added 7,000 kilometers of bike paths, many of them fully separated from traffic. That's a 70% increase in just a few years. These were not just lines painted on roads, they were protected lanes, thoughtfully designed intersections, and routes that actually went where people needed to go: schools, shops, offices, train stations. By the end of the 1980s, cycling in the Netherlands was not just a political issue or a cultural memory. It was infrastructure, permanent, visible, and growing. By the early 1990s, the Netherlands had thousands of kilometers of bike paths, but something strange was happening. Cycling rates were not going up as much as expected. People liked the new lanes, but many still chose to drive. Because even with great bike infrastructure, driving was still easy, fast, and cheap. So Dutch planners shifted focus. They didn't just build for bikes, they started making driving less convenient, especially in dense city centers. They narrowed streets, dropped speed limits to 30 kilometers per hour in residential zones, added raised crossings, speed bumps, and chicanes that forced drivers to slow down. They introduced Fietsstraten, bike streets where cars were technically allowed but treated as guests, and many cities expanded car-free zones in their historic cores. In these areas, the only wheels you'd see were on bikes, delivery carts, or strollers. To back it all up, they passed a new kind of traffic law. In 1991, the Netherlands introduced strict liability. In any collision between a car and a cyclist, the driver's insurance was automatically responsible, unless they could prove the cyclist did something extreme. That changed how people drove. It made them more cautious, especially around kids on bikes. They didn't stop there. Dutch driving schools began teaching the Dutch reach, opening your car door with your far hand, forcing you to turn your body and check for passing cyclists. All of this worked together: slower cars, smarter design, safer laws, better habits. And instead of mandating helmets, which might discourage casual cycling, the Dutch doubled down on safer streets. The idea was simple: if the environment feels safe, people will ride. It wasn't about forcing anyone to cycle. It was about making it the most logical choice. Infrastructure explains a lot, but not everything. To understand why cycling thrives in the Netherlands, you also have to look at the culture. Here, riding a bike is not a political statement. It's not something reserved for athletes in spandex. It's not a weekend activity. It's just how people get around. Teenagers bike to school, parents haul toddlers in front-loaded cargo bikes, seniors ride electric bikes to the grocery store, people wear whatever they're wearing, no helmets, no gear, no second thought. That normality is a big part of what makes the system work. It starts early. By age 4 or 5, most Dutch kids already know how to ride. By the time they're 12, many take a national cycling exam at school, a kind of graduation into independent mobility. They get tested on rules, signals, and safe behavior. Those who pass receive a traffic diploma. And the learning goes both ways. Drivers are trained to watch for cyclists. Dutch driving exams are notoriously strict, and they emphasize bike awareness. Things like checking your mirrors, yielding to bikes in roundabouts, and even opening your door is all part of the test. The result is a kind of shared mindset. Roads are not just for cars, they're for everyone, and everyone has responsibilities. That kind of culture doesn't happen overnight, but it's what makes the system feel intuitive. It's why a teenager can safely bike across a major city, and it's why an 80-year-old can still run errands without needing a car. When cycling becomes second nature, so does the idea that streets should be designed around people, not traffic. Today, the Netherlands has over 35,000 kilometers of dedicated bike paths. That's more than the total road network in some countries. But the Dutch aren't stopping there. They've built multi-level bike parking garages that hold thousands of bikes. Utrecht's main train station has space for over 12,000. Digital signs show how many spots are left, and some stations let you scan your card and roll your bike straight onto a train. They've also adapted for electric bikes, which have exploded in popularity, especially among older riders and long-distance commuters. Paths are being widened, speed rules are being updated, even delivery companies are switching to electric cargo bikes to beat traffic. And when it rains, some cities give cyclists green lights more often, so they don't have to wait in the storm. There are also glowing bike paths, solar-powered lanes, and heated cycleways being tested in the colder northern regions. The Dutch know that if they want to stay ahead, they can't coast on what's already been built. They treat cycling infrastructure the same way other countries treat highways, something that always needs to improve, expand, and adapt. And the results? Safer cities, lower emissions, more active lives. Dutch adults cycle an average of 1,000 kilometers a year. That means most people are getting daily, low-intensity exercise without even thinking about it. Studies estimate that cycling adds about 6 months to the average Dutch life expectancy. It prevents around 6,500 premature deaths per year, and the country saves billions in healthcare costs simply because people are moving their bodies on the way to work or school. And then there's the environment. Every time someone chooses a bike over a car, that's less fuel burned, less congestion, less noise, less pollution in cities where people actually breathe the air. Dutch carbon emissions from transport are significantly lower than car-centric countries like the US or Australia, and it's not about guilt or lifestyle branding, it's just how the system works. By now, the benefits are obvious, so why haven't more countries done the same? It's not for lack of bikes, it's not for lack of space, and it's definitely not because people in other countries don't want safer, cleaner, easier ways to get around. It comes down to 3 things: history, habits, and politics. The Netherlands already had a strong cycling culture before the car boom. When driving started to dominate in the 1960s, they didn't start from scratch. They were rebuilding something they almost lost. In places like the US, Canada, or Australia, that foundation wasn't there. The car arrived early and cities were built around it. The result? Long distances, wide roads, zoning laws that separate homes from shops, schools, and offices, making a bike commute feel almost impossible. Then there's political will. The Dutch made hard choices. They removed parking spaces. They slowed down cars. They told drivers, this street is not for you anymore. That's not an easy sell, even in the Netherlands. But imagine trying that in a city where 90% of residents commute by car and every shopping mall is surrounded by a moat of asphalt. And finally, culture. In the Netherlands, riding a bike doesn't make you unusual, it makes you normal. In other places, bikes are still seen as toys, fitness equipment, or something only poor people use when they have no other option. That perception is changing, but slowly, and without a trigger, like a national protest movement or a fuel crisis, it's hard to get enough momentum to change policy at scale. That doesn't mean it's impossible. Cities like Paris, Bogota, and Copenhagen are making huge strides. London and New York have started copying Dutch-style bike lanes and seeing results. But progress often comes in small bursts, followed by long delays. The Dutch model works because it's not just about infrastructure. It's about making the bike the most convenient option. That requires coordination across departments, across decades, and across political cycles. And most of all, it requires someone to go first. So the question is not whether your city can become more like the Netherlands. The question is, what's stopping it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you soon in the next one.